Who is Neanderthal? And yeah, there was a time, I remember when I was an undergraduate student, I was taught that Neanderthals are humans. And we look at the bones of Neanderthals, they're identical to humans, they're anatomically identical to us. Well, that's been thoroughly refuted over the past couple of decades.
The first thing that we need to note here is that Hugh Ross only considers Homo sapiens humans. He doesn't refer to any other species of the genus Homo as humans. In reality, every species listed in the genus Homo is considered human, just a different type of human. This is the 1856 discovery, Neanderthal 1, that became the type specimen for the species. It was recognized as being different from modern humans because of the shape of the skull and the real heavy eyebrow ridges. In 1908, a nearly complete skeleton was found in France, and a study was published that highlighted the differences, and at the time it was considered a missing link between apes and humans. In the 1930s, they were still considered apish brutes, like this image depicted in the Chicago Field Museum from 1933. To my knowledge, it wasn't until the 1980s that people really started to change their minds or their opinion about Neanderthals. I don't know where in the 1960s they were teaching that they were the same as us.
And part of it was through the discovery of DNA from Neanderthals. And by the way, we've always had DNA from Neanderthals, but new technology allows us to recover DNA from Neanderthals in which we can actually get a faithful record of what the DNA sample is like. Now, when I say faithful, it's about 67% reliable. And so the problem with DNA is it decays very quickly if you've got water or if you've got bacteria or oxygen in the environment. So what they try to do is find Neanderthal bones that have been buried where they've been cut off from the bacteria, the oxygen, and the water, and then try to pull the DNA out. And, given that we're looking at several tens of thousands of years minimum, you get quite a bit of decay in the DNA, and even under the best of circumstances.
Now, he's right that the rate of decay for DNA varies a lot from sample to sample, depending on the environment in which the fossil was preserved in. But a lot of the data coming up, you're going to see right away here, is real dated, out of date, I should say. I know that the study he's referring to was published in 2008, so it had to have been at least since then, though.
But thanks to new technology, they now have mitochondrial DNA from 20 different specimens. And if you're not familiar with that, that's the DNA that we get from our mothers. We only get it from our mothers. The father makes no contribution. And the wonderful thing about that is it allows you to trace the history of a particular species through the female line. The problem, however, is each of us gets about 500 sets of this mitochondrial DNA. The nuclear DNA, you get 2. The mitochondrial DNA, you get much more. But what they've been able to do in looking at these 20 different specimens of Neanderthal skeletons is they know, first of all, they can't measure any significant evolution in the DNA. And this is disturbing to the evolutionary model because, after all, these creatures have been here from about 150,000 years ago to somewhere between 40 and 50,000 years ago. If you're going to claim that the human species is a product of natural descent from bipedal primates that preceded us, then you must be able to see significant change in the DNA over a period of about 50 to 100,000 years. In the case of these Neanderthal specimens, that's been refuted. We don't see that evolution. The DNA seems to be static.
Like I said, a lot of his information is really outdated, and 10 years ago is a long time in human evolution as far as data goes, especially genetic information. We now have a near complete genome sequence of mitochondrial DNA that's over 400,000 years old, and it shows significant evolution between then and the more recent fossil samples from the Neanderthals that date around 40,000 years old.
And also, when we compare the DNA with human DNA, it's about 99% similar to human DNA. But that 1% difference is sufficient that it's now been recognized this must be a distinct species that in no way played a role in the descent down to human beings. And so because of this discovery, Neanderthals are now labeled as a side branch of human evolution by those who believe in the evolutionary model. And so Neanderthal has now been discounted as an ancestor, which means nobody here can say that their son or their husband is a Neanderthal. This DNA evidence has ruled that out completely.
I agree with him that Neanderthals were a separate species, although very closely related to us, but I have to disagree that they didn't contribute at all to modern humans. It's likely that almost everyone laughing in that room has up to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their own genome. I'm 1.5%, a little more than average. As long as you have ancestry from outside of Africa, you're going to have up to 4%. So much has been learned about Neanderthals in just the last few years. Here's about a 4.5-minute clip from a Nova PBS special called Decoding Neanderthals that aired back in 2012, and it's going to help show exactly why Hugh Ross is wrong.
Neanderthals, our closest relatives. Scientists have been trying to solve their mystery for decades. Why did they become extinct? And could there be something of the Neanderthal in us? The Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. For the first time ever, researchers have presented the gene sequence of an extinct prehistoric human. The geneticist Svante Pääbo, one of the directors of the institute, has been working on decoding the Neanderthal genome since 1997. Finally, he and his team have achieved their goal, and their findings have caused a worldwide sensation. The Neanderthal has actually left traces in the genome of modern humans of between 2 and 4%.
The fascinating thing is that we're a mosaic. Our genome is a kind of mosaic. When I go across a chromosome, I'm in one part more closely related to you than to another person. Then, as we go further, I'm perhaps more closely related to some other person than to you. And then, more related to someone in Africa than to you, and now and again, more closely related to a Neanderthal than to you. So what these results actually show is that this large mosaic, this great big puzzle, contains parts which are from the Neanderthal.
The greatest difficulty for the scientists: avoiding contamination of the fossil specimen with their own DNA, and with the DNA of bacteria present on the bones. A special clean room was set up in Leipzig. Only here could specimens be taken. The researchers developed numerous new techniques to separate ancient DNA from new. Vindija near Zagreb in Croatia. Most of the bones for the Neanderthal Genome Project were found here. The limestone cave provided ideal conditions for their preservation. It too played a role in decoding the genome. The icon in German archaeology, discovered near Mettmann in 1856. The Neanderthal was named after this fossil. To throw light on the Neanderthal's relationship to modern man, the researchers sequenced 5 additional genomes. They stem from people from all over the world. The comparison with the Neanderthal genome brought completely unexpected results. It is obvious that Neanderthals and early modern humans mixed. However, the inheritance from the Neanderthal is unevenly distributed across the world.
The most astonishing thing was that we find this small contribution in Europeans and in Asians, but not in Africans. It seems to be something that Europeans and Asians have in common, but which is missing in Africans. A small part of the Neanderthal genome.
Why are the genes scattered so unevenly across the world?
How can it be that the Neanderthal has contributed to individuals in parts of the world which were never actually inhabited by Neanderthals? The most likely hypothesis we have is that this mixing with Neanderthals happened very early, with ancestors of the ones we're examining from Croatia. The most likely area for this is the Middle East.
100,000 to 50,000 years before our time. Anatomical modern humans migrate from Africa and encounter Neanderthals in the Middle East. The groups mix. This takes place before Homo sapiens' triumphal march across the world. And their genetic pack, they carry with them a few Neanderthal genes. It is the researchers' goal not only to get to know the Neanderthal better. They find information in the genes of our extinct cousin which concerns all of us. By discovering what we have in common and what makes us different, we are discovering our own history.
So now we not only have mitochondrial DNA, we have nuclear DNA from Neanderthals that we can compare with modern humans. And we can see that at least 20% of the Neanderthal genome is preserved in us. I might have 1.3%, you might have 2%, but your percent and my percent may not have come from the same part of the Neanderthal genome. Now that doesn't mean that Neanderthals are ancestral to our species as a whole, but it supports the hypothesis that early humans left Africa at different times, with later groups meeting up with groups that had migrated previously.
The other thing is, when we look at the skeletons of the DNA, or these Neanderthals in some detail, we now realize they're not anatomically identical to human beings. They're distinct from human beings. We notice that they're much heavier than us, but there's about 100 skeletons of Neanderthals that have been uncovered. So that's kind of the total database of Neanderthals. And none of the skeletons are complete. But they're several of them are a lot better than the Lucy find, which is about 35% complete.
42%.
So we have the best of all the bipedal primates that precede human beings. Neanderthals are where you got the best skeletal evidence.
Once again, Neanderthals were humans. They weren't just bipedal primates. They were slightly different than us, and yes, they had several defining features, but they were still considered human.
Keep in mind that those little figurines they have in Neanderthals, that's basically an artist's guess. They're not showing you the actual bones. Yeah, they got the bones there. Here, I'll tell you the irony. It was the discovery of the first Neanderthal fossil in the Neander Valley that launched Charles Darwin to publish his book, Descent of Man. And his belief was that that fossil had proven that we were naturally descended from bipedal primates that preceded us. The irony is that very same skeleton was where they got the first mitochondrial DNA analysis. And that very first DNA, it was published about 12 years ago, demonstrated that the thing that launched Charles Darwin's book, Descent of Man, indeed proved that it wasn't an ancestor of the human species because the DNA was so radically different. So that's kind of a historical background there. Here's this first Neanderthal fossil that convinced Charles Darwin that we must be descended from these bipedal primates, and now they got Neanderthal evidence from that very same specimen that proves the opposite.
I couldn't find anything to substantiate that claim at all. The Neanderthal fossil he's talking about was discovered in 1856. Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859 and didn't publish The Descent of Man until 1871. An article by Richard Klein, published by the National Academy of Sciences back in 2009, seems to tell a different story. In The Descent of Man, 1871, he said that addressing human evolution in 1859 would only add to the prejudices against my views. Satisfied now that those prejudices had significantly receded, he deployed an array of comparative, anatomical, embryological, and behavioral observations to argue that people had evolved in the same manner as other species. The fossil record now confirms that Darwin and Huxley were right to place human origins in Africa, but when they were writing, fossil support for human evolution was almost absent. The most meaningful exception was the Neanderthal skull cap and associated limb bones recovered by quarry workers from a limestone cave near Dusseldorf, Germany in 1856. Unfortunately, the antiquity of the bones was unclear, and there seemed to be a reasonable possibility that the skull came from a pathological modern human. So apparently Darwin just felt there wasn't enough evidence at the time, and that the skull they found could have been possibly a modern human. So instead he relied on other evidences like the similarities between us and the other modern apes.
But let me review some of the distinct morphology. They were bigger than we are in terms of body mass, but their arms and legs were considerably shorter than ours. And they were a lot rounder than we are. Their rib cage was a lot more bulged out than our rib cage. And as I mentioned last week, those are characteristics you'd want to have if you're living in a relatively cold climate. And that's where we find the Neanderthals, Europe and southern Siberia. By the way, they never made it into northern Europe or northern Siberia. It's basically lower and central Europe and Siberia.
The reason we don't really find them further north is because it would have been just too cold. They lived there during the last glacial maximum.
And we find their bones most frequently in caves, which is where you want to go where it's cold.
Well, the reason we most frequently find their bones in caves is caves are more conducive to preserving fossils.
And but they had the ideal body shape for a bipedal primate for dealing with a cold climate, and they particularly were blessed with a huge nasal capacity, which allowed them to breathe in cold air without searing or damaging their lungs. In fact, a number of anatomists have noted that the nasal capacity of the Neanderthal is so extremely large, it doesn't fit into any evolutionary tree. Not for the bipedal primates, not for any other mammal line. No mammal has such an enormous nasal capacity. And so they noted that as a challenge to the entire evolutionary paradigm for mammals. How can you possibly explain that huge nasal capacity? On the other hand, if God is wanting to design this species to live in a cold climate, that's exactly what you expect God to do.
Well, of course, he has to make a case for special creation of Neanderthals here, but there's also evidence that these traits evolved as the response to cold weather. Their nasal opening was larger and broader than ours, but it wasn't that much bigger. Our common ancestor with Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, was only slightly taller than your average Neanderthal. Most of the height difference between us and Neanderthals was in the tibia and fibula.
The other thing we notice is that the hole that takes the spinal column has a very different shape than for the human. I think for the human it's circular, and for the Neanderthal it's an ellipse, very elliptical.
What he's talking about here is the foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull where the spine enters. And on some Neanderthal fossils, we see it slightly elongated or oval shape, but really not much different than even modern humans.
Okay, I've run out of time, but next week I want to look at Homo erectus, because the new paradigm is this. Okay, we know Neanderthal is not an argument for an evolutionary paradigm, but maybe what happened is we're descended from Homo erectus. And so they're claiming that Homo erectus gave rise independently to both Neanderthals and humans, that we both split off from Homo erectus. Now, the case of Homo erectus is so ancient, namely 200,000 to 1.8 million years ago, that we don't have any reliable DNA. So the DNA we get from these creatures is useless to tell us anything about them. They're just simply too far back in time. So we don't have any DNA. But what I'm going to talk about is how different their morphology is from both Neanderthals and humans. So the morphology itself eliminates Homo erectus as a candidate for giving rise to both Neanderthals and to human beings.
I will be covering his lecture on Homo erectus, but first I'll be covering another one that he did on Neanderthals, and then after that I'll also be doing one on early Homo sapiens that he did. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe.